I am a bald, vegan, book reading, yoga practicing cat lover who likes wearing sensible shoes, otherwise known as a walking lesbian stereotype. This story is my coming out story. My mum has actually told her side of this story twice at 10 by 9 before. So if you've not been at those, spoiler, she's pretty chill about it the whole way through. I had the least dramatic coming out. I want you to be really prepared for an anti-climactic version of a coming out story. I had a single frame of reference for how to come out. Snippets of TV shows with skinny white boys yelling, "No, Mum, I'm gay," and mothers sobbing heartbroken into tissues while fathers bellowed in a corner. I had reached 17 with minimal yelling at my parents and wasn't entirely sure that this was the moment to start. I also knew that my parents were unlikely to be sobbing into tissues as I shattered all their hopes and dreams for me. They were vegetarian before supermarkets had an aisle for them. We had a compost heap in the garden on a council estate where the curbs were painted and flags hung for every house but ours. We discussed communication styles like jackal and giraffe ears at the dinner table. I grew up with extra great uncles, two gorgeous men who are my grandparents' best friends, and who had an impossibly beautiful house with a lot of ornaments that we weren't allowed to touch. I knew that my parents would be lovely. I also knew that coming out boiled down to telling my parents what I wanted for my future sex life, and this was the most excruciating conversation I could imagine, since my mum tricked me into going on a car journey with her from outside Derry all the way to Lisburn, where I was reminded about the importance of safe sex, how to access the family planning clinic, and that if I had any questions, I could ask her anything. I had no questions because no matter how amazing my mum was and is, 17-year-old me was not going to be continuing this conversation for any longer than was geographically necessary. I made the decision to tell them once I was dating someone. That way, I didn't have to talk about who I fancied, or even choose the right word for why I fancied them. All the information I needed to give was that I was dating a girl. It was a beautiful cop-out, because at that stage of my awkward, nerdy existence, there was only the remotest possibility of me getting a date with anyone, anytime, in the next few years. I didn't have any good reason to tell my parents anything until a friend mentioned that someone we'd both met on a joint school trip to Auschwitz-Birkenau, of all places, was also gay. It'd been a surreal trip, all packed into 23 and a half hours from leaving Belfast to returning. I'd been numbed to my core as we went through one horrendous exhibit of human suffering and brutality after another. She had been clutching a notebook in one hand and a ballpoint pen in the other, asking questions of everyone we met. The guides, the trip organisers, the other students from schools across Belfast. She asked difficult questions and accepted even more difficult answers. Some of the other students didn't think it was really all that important to visit places like this. She asked, why not? How should it be remembered? What should be done? What would it look like in Northern Ireland? She was going to be writing about it when she got home for her school newspaper. She exchanged contact details with my friend and we promised to keep in touch. Did you know that the girl we met on that trip was gay? She told me the other night. Oh, I didn't get her details. Could you pass them on? So we spent hours chatting on MSN Messenger. I learnt to touch type-ish, frantically spilling out every thought and feeling. Meeting someone else my age, who was gay, who was a woman, who was single. We set our first date for Valentine's Day. We would meet in Castle Court in the food court for Pizza Hut, classy. Valentine's was tomorrow though, which meant that if I was sticking by my self-imposed rule of tell them when there's something to tell them about, I needed to tell my parents soon. She said it would be fine. She said it might be awkward or embarrassing, but she said that like it was an okay thing to do and not a reason to avoid it. I'm going to be late for the train. Can I have a lift? My mum, you don't want to be late for a first date. It's my fault that you're going to miss the train. True. I'll give you a lift all the way to Belfast. It's Valentine's. We better make sure you have a card. Who's the lucky boy? Oh, well it's their girl. Oh, what time do you think you might want to be picked up? Would you like me to tell your grandparents? What an easy, uncomplicated, beautiful coming out story. I told it for years with a genuine sort of pride in my parents, in the progression of LGBTQ plus rights, or just in joy. I'd build it up at uni. How might they react? What was my mum going to say? The punchline was, what time do you want picked up? My mum looked after me and did tell my grandparents. They were great too, by the way, not just in a passive way, but truly actively. My grandma wrote a letter to the Church of Ireland Gazette after the Irish same-sex marriage referendum, telling off the bishops and ministers who had not supported it. I'd like to think it was my influence, but it turns out they'd both been writing and talking about LGBTQ plus rights in the church for years. I just didn't know. It was a story that, when asked by young people at youth groups, I could offer up with hope, or give as an example of compassion for parents who were concerned that they might be about to have that conversation with their kids. It was such an uncomplicated story until Easter half term, just over a year ago. I was a teacher in England by then and living in a rhythm of terms, half terms, summer holidays and more terms. I just started up a small LGBTQ plus group in school after a group of students had come up and asked for a space to chat about gay things at lunchtime. This Easter half term, the girl I'd been going to meet for my first date, who had encouraged me over MSN, telling my parents that it would be okay, and had given me the reason to do so by being willing to eat pizza with me in a food court, was shot and killed while reporting on a violent incident in Derry. It was a moment that shook me to my core and reverberated far beyond these small islands. It was the news cycle for weeks. Northern Ireland is a small place. It turns out we have more mutual friends than I realised. I turned off the news. I cried and I went for walks and made nettle soup and saw friends and cried some more. We hadn't seen each other in years. We commented on Facebook posts and made promises to meet up for coffee the next time I was in Northern Ireland. It was only after she died I finally watched her TED talk that I'd had bookmarked for months. I went back to school for the summer term, bruised and grieving. The first Wednesday back to school was her funeral. I had never felt further away from home than in a classroom in England that day, teaching maths to a group of students who didn't want to learn maths. I got it. I didn't want to be there either. Wednesday lunchtimes was the LGBTQ plus group lunchtimes. It was a small group that lunchtime. Students always forgot at the start of term. They would double in size by week 3 when they got back into the rhythms of term. The students had just spent 2 weeks at home with family members, all along the spectrum of what counts as supportive, and were offering each other stories and advice and humour and compassion. What about you, miss? How were your parents? How did you tell them? My uncomplicated coming out story sat stuck in my throat. I was grieving not just for her, but for my country, my community, my 17-year-old self. How could I share all of that with a group of teenagers in a high school in Kent? They offered to hold a silence that lunchtime. The next lunchtime, they said, "We want to march in Canterbury Pride as a school. What do we need to do to organise?" We were the first school to march in our city's pride. They wrote letters of affirmation and support to the school in Birmingham being picketed by anti-LGBTQ+ protesters. They asked about the history of Pride and of Stonewall, and they researched and brought back stories to share with the group of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and queer people who, with deeds small and large, lives short and long, had made an impact throughout history. They said, "It's really hard to call people out when they're homophobic in school. Can we have a badge to make it more official, like the prefects? It'll be really embarrassing and probably awkward, but we think that's okay. We think we should do it anyway." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. That's so beautiful. I've heard the story told from your mother's point of view a few times, and then hearing you tell it, and then the addendum afterwards. Well, both of them, you know, not just about the murder and the funeral, but also then about your work in the school. So moving. Thank you so much. Beautiful.
Thank